So we're gonna divide this night in 3 stages. Our first stage, we're gonna talk about what 5G is. The second part of the presentations is gonna be about what does it does for you, what does it does, like in health effects and how does it work. And we're gonna end with the community action and what's happening in the background and the community sort of side of things. So, Richard, welcome. Give a round of applause for Richard.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. It's lovely to be here this evening, and it's a pleasure to be given the opportunity to talk to you tonight about what 5G is, and also we'll do some myth busting and figure out what 5G is not, so we're much more clear about what the technology proposal that's coming our way is and what it will mean for us. I'm not a telecommunications engineer despite my background, so I am an informed member of the community, and that's about as far as it goes. But I listened to if you haven't listened already, there was an interview on Radio National on Friday with a doctor from La Trobe University and the Deputy Director of ARPANSA, who, if you don't know who ARPANSA are, they are the standard-setting body in Australia for radiation, and that's non-ionising as well as ionising radiation. They're the people that set the exposure limits that we're facing. There was an interview on Friday, and there was just so many holes in that I took to YouTube, created the EMF Inspector YouTube channel, and put my 3/4 of an hour response on there. Go ahead and listen. I don't think I got anything wrong, but I'm quite happy to correct any mistakes I may have made. But let's keep going. I'm going to try and keep this as short as I can. I made these slides over the weekend and then cut them in half because there's so much we could talk about. That's who I am. I'm sorry, you won't be able to read most of this, so I'm going to help you. So, 5G frequencies. This is all the technology. So 5G is a real grab bag of different pieces of technology that are all being brought to bear in the next generation of mobile technology. It's a new range of frequencies that will be used to communicate with our devices. It includes a technology called phased array antennas and multi-output, or MIMO. We'll talk about these things in a bit. Those allow beamforming. Small cells and densification, that's a big part of the 5G story that we're hearing about. And I'll also talk about the waveform and why that matters. There's a lot more we could talk about, things like software-defined radio, high capacity, lower latency, lower power. We could talk for hours about security or insecurity. One of the pushes is that telecommunications will be able to get rid of Wi-Fi and mobile data as being separate, and we'll just have a single plan that doesn't matter whether you're at home or on the road, it'll be the same plan. We won't talk about that. It's the same technology whether it's a big base station or whether it's a tiny little thermometer in your house. I could talk about why NBN is driving 5G and why Australia is really one of the is at the forefront of 5G rollout, but I won't. And we could also have a long debate about whether 5G is going to give us higher or lower exposure, but that's not for tonight. So what do we currently have? This is a spectrum of frequency. So EMF is the term, electromagnetic radiation. Light is electromagnetic radiation. Radio waves are electromagnetic radiation, UV, infrared, right up to X-ray and gamma ray radiation. That's all just on this spectrum from radio waves down the bottom end, right up to X-rays and gamma rays at the top. Light is here, and then we get into the radio waves, which are lower. And you'll hear them say, well, because it's not non-ionizing, which is this part of the spectrum, because it's non-ionizing, it's only heat that we have to worry about. I'm not going to talk about that. Mobile phones are currently around about here on the spectrum, and they're talking about pushing into 10 gigahertz, 30 gigahertz, 50, 80 gigahertz, which is higher up the spectrum, into this microwave and millimeter wave spectrum. Now, interestingly, with 4G, they're already pushing into these higher pieces, not 10 gigahertz, but Mobile phones started less than a gigahertz, 700, 800 megahertz in the old days, and they pushed gradually higher. Wi-Fi sits at 2.4 gigahertz, and LTE 4G is currently pushing over 3.5 gigahertz. So that's important because some of these higher frequencies are already being brought into the current 4G piece. 4G is also going to be around for another 20 odd years as well, so let's not forget that. Let's keep going. What about 5G then? Because I think this is, I put this set of slides first. I think that everybody is most concerned about the millimeter wave radiation that's being talked about with 5G, and this is something that we need to address right off the bat. Most 5G radiation is not going to be millimeter wave radiation. I'm sorry to tell you, but if that's what everybody's here to hear about, well, have a cup of tea and we'll see you later. But it doesn't mean there aren't problems. So let's not lose all hope for the event. The problem with these extra high frequencies that they've been talking about, discussing about 5G, is that they just don't work. Unless you happen to be in direct line of sight of the antenna with your hand strategically placed so you don't cover the antenna, it doesn't work. It doesn't work if you're behind a pane of glass. It doesn't work if you're behind a sheet of paper. It doesn't work. And these are fundamental physics problems that I know they're going to try and solve, but they haven't solved them yet. And they don't need to solve them yet either, because 5G is going to play in the current mobile phone spectrum that they currently have. They're going to recycle that spectrum and they're going to reuse it for 5G, which makes sense, of course, because if you're on a road trip and you're in the countryside, you still want 5G reception. That's going to be provided over the same spectrum that we currently have for mobile phones. Nothing much is going to change. There will be some use of the millimeter spectrum in 5G. It'll be used for point-to-point, so if they need to connect two towers together, because 5G can be used for tower-to-tower communication, they'll use directional antenna, the dishes that you see, and those will be directing higher frequency beams between the towers. Satellites they're talking about, they may use them as well. But the most of what we're going to see is going to be, I would suspect, what have we got? China is experimenting up to 5 gigahertz, Telstra's at 3.5 gigahertz. America, where they're rolling this out very quickly, is actually much lower, 600 megahertz for T-Mobile, 700 for AT&T. And that's one of the things. 5G allows you to play on many parts of the spectrum where 4G and 3G didn't let you do that before. Telstra have been experimenting with highs. 26 gigahertz is what they did on the Gold Coast when the Commonwealth Games were on. And I think that's also what they'll have around some of the shops in town so they can show off their nice new Samsung phones. But there are also other sources of millimeter waves in the community that are currently active. Those are, if you have a distance sensing car that has an adaptive cruise control, that's using millimeter waves, 76 to 77 gigahertz. The weather radar is a huge emitter. Broadmeadows is a 250 kilowatt, 5.6 gigahertz source, and the Laverton radar at 2.8 gigahertz is 750 kilowatts, pulsing 250 kilometers radius from Melbourne. It's huge. Satellites also use millimeter waves, such as the Skymaster system if you are in the country and trying to get NBN. That's what's inside the Laverton weather radar, a huge antenna, and this is a ground station for the NBN. Millimeter waves, as I said, are a problem because they just don't penetrate, and this is going to be hard to take in, but the takeaway here is that a 10 gigahertz signal is absorbed very heavily as it goes through a body of tissue, like meat. So by 10 centimeters, it's already a barely detectable signal, whereas 1 gigahertz, which is where we're currently at, passes nearly straight through the body. This was an interesting slide again. I'm sorry you won't be able to see it very well, but they are doing a lot of work with mobile phone devices to look at how they can use fancy signal processing to get the radiation to come away from the body and then in the direction they want, and how it might interact with the head. Let's keep going. I'm particularly concerned about the impact on the skin of higher frequency radiation. And the reason for that is because while ICNIRP are the international bunch of crooks who decide how we should interpret science, they've declared that skin as a secondary organ and therefore is much lower on the priority list for exposure calculations. Now the problem with that is that the skin is not inert. The skin has mast cells and the skin has T cells which are immune, it's your front line of immune defense, and if that part of the skin is absorbing most of the radiation, I think you'll see an uptick in autoimmune diseases. I'm very concerned about that. With these higher frequencies, I'm more concerned about autoimmunity than I am about cancer. But I'll let Bronwyn talk to that because she's more qualified. Okay, the second cool thing that comes with 5G is beamforming and phased arrays. That's a fancy set of terms, but it basically means that they can steer the radiation. They can form beams of radiation instead of just this light spreads its light in all directions. If you have a fancy set of antennas here, you can actually direct the energy preferably in one direction versus another. This is one of these soundbars you have on the TV, and the idea of these is you have one soundbar for your TV and you get surround sound. And it works on the same principle, like you steer beams of sound around the room. Well, 5G will allow you to steer beams of radiation around the community. Which is fantastic, right? Because then instead of what we currently have with 4G and below, where we basically bathe the entire community in a uniform or a near uniform swathe of radiation, 5G will allow us to pinpoint a 5G device and just direct the energy at that one device. So that's great, right? Because if we're not holding a 5G device, we're not going to be targeted. Of course, there is a slight wrinkle in that, which is if you happen to be in the way of somebody who's trying to make a 5G call, you're going to get sideswiped, so sorry about that, but whoops. The other part of this, which is particularly insidious, is that it makes it very difficult to make EMF calculations and radiation exposure calculations. I suspect that what you'll see is much higher exposure levels when you are directly targeted by a beam than if you're not. And the other thing to look at, if we look at this little diagram here, yes, we have very high signal straight ahead. We also get sidebands. You can't get rid of sidebands. You get sideswiped by radiation even though it's not directed straight at you. But this is a big play for 5G. This is one of the key technologies that they want to do. Because with beamforming, they can actually, with one device, they can provide a different signal to every device in the room. With 50 people here, they can easily handle that with one cell. And everybody's having a different conversation with the base station at the same time. So this is what they're going to be really aggressively looking for, because when they have to deal with everyone going on their lunch hour in the CBD, and everybody's complaining because they have poor download speeds, this is one of the main technologies that they're going to be trying to roll out to make that better. I also suspect they're going to try and bring this in with 4G as well, because there'll be a lot of 4G for the years to come. So a 5G base station has a dense array of small antennas and we can direct signals. This is interesting as well, so they'll have a similar arrangement on the device itself, on your mobile phone. And they'll be able to steer beams from the phone to the base station and from the base station to your phone. Another factor which gets a lot of noise with 5G is small cells and densification. Densification means that they'll be looking to put many, many more base stations into the cities and into our communities. They're also doing that with 4G as well. So we need to be aware of that. This is a diagram I got off the CSIRO, where we moved from 50 base stations per square kilometre to 250 base stations per square kilometre to 2,500 base stations per square kilometre, and this was a presentation about 4G. They're pushing this every which way. And this doesn't account for the fact that you've got Telstra and Optus and Vodafone and TPG and NBN and you name it, all these different carriers, and they're all putting in their own infrastructure trying to do the same thing. And the reason for this is because if I need to be provided with a high-speed video augmented reality data feed, and so does George, and so does somebody down the street, it's much easier to provide that for me if I have a base station that's close to me, and that George is on a separate one. And that's why they're going to be pushing this everywhere, and that's why they're going to be coming much closer to us. They're going to be much more at person height. They're talking about it's great if you can have it at head height. Yeah, thanks. Not for me, I don't want that at head height. But that's what they're pushing out for both 4G and 5G. Much smaller, much more tightly packed base stations. Now, of course, they won't be anywhere near as powerful, so that's fantastic, right? But what you do get is much less holes of low radiation and a much more uniform distribution of radiation. There's nowhere to hide. And did I say it's already here? This is a photo that I took at Olinda. In downtown Olinda, this is the base station at the Exchange building there in Olinda Centre, as well as the big conventional antennas that you can see as well. There's these small pizza box size boxes, and I went and I tried to figure out what the hell they were because I wanted to know if that was 5G. I don't think it is. I think these are 4G small cells, and they're specifically designed to target high density locations where there's lots of people all wanting to take nice little photographs outside the ivy and post them on Facebook. So these are outside St. Joe's, and when you start driving around, you'll see lots of these. So again, they're lower powered, but they're intended for very dense locations. I think the other thing that they'll try to do with 5G is when they send you a Wi-Fi modem in the post for free, fantastic, they'll also be piggybacking other services on top of that. They already do with this Telstra device. The last thing I wanted to cover here, because I know time's precious, is waveform matters. So 3G and 4G radiation are different in their characteristics. 3G was not polarized, 4G was polarized, and they actually use polarization. You're familiar with your sunnies, and if you turn them one way, you can black out. That's polarization. And they do the same thing with radiation for cell phones, and they can get more information in there. They'll also be packing much more dense data onto that and using much more advanced signal processing to pack the data in and then decode the data. A lot of technical jargon in there. The key part of that is that it has already been demonstrated that with existing mobile phone technology, the type of waveforms that are used have a direct implication on health. There was a study released last year, the NTP study, the biggest study on mobile phone radiation ever done, $25 million and a lot of rats used, and they demonstrated that CDMA and GSM, which are the two competing 3G standards, produce different health effects. One produces more brain cancer, one produces more liver cancer, and so on and so on. They actually demonstrated specifics about the waveforms. Now, the problem with 5G is that there is no standard for waveform. It's all software defined, which means it can change over time and can be adapted, and the adaptation that will be made is much denser and much more aggressive. So we will see much more aggressive information in the air, much more aggressive use of the EMF spectrum, and I think that's going to cause an unknown amount of effects. Of course, not just to humans, but everything else. So with that, I tried to keep myself as short as I could. There's a whole bunch of other stuff we could talk about, but I'm not going to. I'm going to hand over to our next presenter. Thank you very much.